some of which relate to the ending of the landfill operator contract, and others are issues that relate to the board's goal and strategic plan. We are planning to schedule another workshop later this spring. Numerous initiatives are being explored, which not only relate directly to the operation of the solid waste facility, but other factors that impact those operations, as well as a review of the fiscal 23 solid waste enterprise fund budget today at the workshop. The finance director will do that. The select board strategic plan focus area of environmental leadership, I wanted to just remind us what that is. It has an associated goal to, quote, provide data-driven recommendations on island-wide solid waste management guided by principles of sustainability. And that is also driving other initiatives as to how the island handles waste at the front end, such as the plastics ban and biodegradable packaging regulations, which we are working on some proposed amendments for you on those, and we'll be bringing those to you in the next, sometime this month, I think. So I think what we'd like to do is, in accordance with the agenda that we've developed, take a quick look at the fiscal 23 solid waste enterprise fund budget and associated capital requests, and then get into some other things that are, a lot of them are follow-ups from your November workshop. So I think we're going to go to Brian.
Okay, thank you, Libby. Erica, would you bring up the story, please? Okay, thank you. Could you scroll down to the actual budget numbers? Because I think it's what we were going to do. One more, actually, right? Yeah, right there. So town administration, along with the DPW director and also the solid waste, the recycling coordinator, have worked with George Aronson, our consultant, on development of the 2023 budget. There are some substantial increases in this budget based on estimated projections of costs associated with the disposal. We're proposing $12,735,557 for the 2023 operating budget for non-personnel costs. The majority of that all increase primarily resides with increase in disposal costs, and we'll break those out in another slide for you down below. We've also have also proposed a operating personnel budget of $548,491, which does include additional time for the take it or leave it attendance. We have one part-time attendant now that we're proposing to bring to full-time. We also have proposed an additional solid waste manager position in the budget. Those also bring accompanying health insurance increases as well. So we propose going from the $280,000 in the 22 budget to $548,000, which, as I mentioned, does include two additional personnel increases. Erica, could you slide down? So actually, I'm sorry, wait 1 second. All told, $13,284,048 versus last year's just under $11 million. Erica, can you go to the next slide? Or scroll down. Currently, right now, we're projecting $11,181,110 in revenue, which leaves us just under $2 million short, which we are working with not only town administration, but George on a review of the estimates to see whether we can bring some down on the expense side, or whether we think or how to increase potential revenue. There's really very limited ways to increase potential revenue into the solid waste operations. So we're going to be faced this year with potentially needing to find more money through raise and appropriate, which will be somewhat tricky and challenging, or funding this deficit and gap if we can't bring any of the projected expenses down, most likely for fiscal 23 via a transfer from free cash in the general fund. I will say that my recommendation to the town manager through this, and we've decided most likely fiscal 24 will be the year to do it, is we most likely are going to need to ask for an additional operating override to cover these costs, because they're certainly at this point not getting any lower or any less expensive to operate the facility. Could you please scroll down a little bit further there? Perfect, thank you. So as I mentioned, we've proposed a solid waste manager position, as well as making the third take it or leave it attendant from part-time to full-time, which I think will certainly help the operation and the management of that program. So we have recommended that to be going from part-time to full-time. On the operational expense side, you'll notice that this is where most of these cost increases are coming from. The collection and disposal and professional services, as well as the collection and disposal for freight, projected to go up approximately a little over $2 million in aggregate. And there is a slight increase in solid waste recycling and MRF professional services of about $30,000. So the majority of the cost increase in this budget are really related to the cost of disposal and the services under the agreement that we have with Waste Options. Here in the capital side, you will see that there was various capital requests. They totaled, I think, over $3 million. We certainly have started to, we're working through a lot of these. We are recommending the smart compact waste receptacles for 151. We need a supplemental appropriation for, we expect we will need this supplemental appropriation, which is why we're asking for it of $332,000 for the replacement of the roof at the materials recovery facility. We're recommending one vehicle for the staff at $40,000. We're recommending upgrades to the MRF facility, specifically restrooms and break rooms at $80,000. This is next one, the materials recovery facility improvements, a concrete pad and catwalk, was something that we had discussed before, but never been put forward into the capital plan. So we are recommending that at $300,000. And then certainly the solid waste coordinator will be able to answer any very project specific questions that the board may have. There's a proposal to move potentially if and when we do not need the trailer at 131 Pleasant anymore, to move it to the solid waste facility site and repurpose it as part of the take it or leave it program. So we are including money in the budget to accommodate this in the future, should that become something that we choose to do, as well as making various building improvements to the current take it or leave it facility of $100,000. The hard to manage waste building, this is basically, I think, a $500,000 request. We do need to replace the sprinklers in the building at $60,000, and we need to make some fence and gate repairs to the landfill and the take it or leave it site, estimated to be $125,000. A request to replace the front gate at the solid waste facility, estimated to be around $60,000 in consultation with Waste Options. Stormwater improvements, I believe, was pushed out for one more year, but we are going to start looking at what that would need to be done, and that's estimated to be about $600,000. And then two other long-term projects being the upgrade to the sorting station and the materials recovery debagger for $346,000 and $125,000 respectively. So I'm happy to answer any questions from the board if they have any on the budget or the capital items that have been worked through.
As was pointed out by the capital committee, solid waste has been, for capital items, has been really underfunded in the past. The MRF is a perfect example as a town-owned facility with, the bathrooms have never been updated since they originally put in 1997. Same with the roof, same with, all those MRF improvements there. So that's why we're seeing a lot of these expenses coming up now, because these should have happened years ago and they just never did. So it speaks to the need to continually invest in town facilities and programs so they don't become into the state.
I guess if there are no budget questions specifically, and this has yet to go to the FinCom, right, Brian? We haven't done this before the FinCom yet.
We have not done this with FinCom yet. That's correct.
So next up, I think we've got what George and Graham, solid waste reduction programs and priorities, if we're going by the items on the agenda.
Yes, I think we'll start with a couple updates from items from our last workshop. Of course, we'll be updating you throughout the whole workshop, but a couple of just quick updates. I'm going to let George take this.
Sure. Next slide, please. Thank you. I think there are a couple of things I just want to cover quickly. One of the basic questions is whether the composter can actually create compost that meets standards for distribution around the island and actually to be marketed. And this is an issue, in fact, because of the question of PFAS and how they're managed on the island and where they go. And the fact that the DP at this point does not have standards for PFAS for compost. And then it's also going to, which will also affect the decision, which we'll be talking about in a fair bit of detail, which is whether the town ought to buy the compost. So I just wanted to show this slide because I know that there's been a lot of concern about PFAS and compost and how are we going to manage them as we go forward. And one of the things we're starting to see, and again, we'll make clear this is preliminary data. There's a lot more data analysis and data taking to get, but it does show a trend that in fact is positive. And if you look at the 3 points, and again, it's preliminary data and not the largest sample size we want, but we're seeing that if you looked at where we were last year in terms of the PFAS content of the compost on 3 different measures, blue, orange, and gray, which are all PFAS taken together, and then 2 individual dominant analytes, they're called, of the PFAS. We've seen that there have been some steps to actually reduce and significantly the PFAS content of the compost that's being produced by the compost. So where we are up in the 20 parts per billion range over a year ago, the decision was made to remove the biosolids, handle them through a different process, not run them through the drum. And when that was done, it basically cut or at least the preliminary data show that the PFAS content of the compost was cut about in half. And when you blend the compost with that has had the biosolids removed with yard waste, you can get down to about 5 or 6. You can get down to about 3/4 below what the original measurements were. So what we've seen is that there are a few measures that have been taken, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but at least from preliminary data, show significant reductions in the compost content or the PFAS content of compost. One of the things we're going to be talking about going forward is removing paper and recycling the paper rather than composting the paper. It's something that now that recycling markets have recovered somewhat, there's more of a possibility to do. But we also know that certain components of paper, packaging and food packaging, et cetera, do contribute PFAS to the mix. So if we remove those from the compost, we believe there'll be further reduction. And also, we're also looking, and this is another topic for later in the workshop, source reduction programs, which could further reduce the PFAS. And we really don't know how far we could go. The question is, and we really don't know what the standard would be. On the other hand, what we are seeing, at least on a preliminary basis, is that the initial measures being taken by the town and by waste options are showing a reduction in PFAS. And if those reductions continue, then it's reasonable to project, depending on a whole host of factors, that we can make a goal where we could get to where the PFAS content of the compost would be at an acceptable level and would meet standards that, again, have been yet to be issued. So again, very preliminary information, but it does project at least a story that supports continuing to look at this and some optimism in the result. Questions on this? Okay, my second summary, next slide, please, Erica. Thank you. This is just about 2 pilot programs that we're right now conducting on behalf of the town. There's been an ongoing question, and a number of people have raised it. Isn't there something else you could do with the material you can't compost on the island rather than ship it off the island? And we're looking at a couple of technologies, pyrolysis and gasification among them, where small facilities might be developed on the island to handle these materials. And in 2 particular vendors that we've been in contact with, one would make electricity from materials, and the other would make what is essentially a drop-in marine diesel fuel. They're both emerging technologies. And so the step one is to actually sample plastic waste from Nantucket and send it to the vendors where they have their own test facilities, and to run some trials to see if they can take the Nantucket material, if they get good results, what those results look like. And that might be the basis for the next step in going down this road. Again, it's a road that's going to take a while. We still have to find a site for the facility. There needs to be a permitting path with the Mass Department of Environmental Protection, or DP. Those lie ahead. But as a first step, let's find out if the material on Nantucket could actually be processed in these materials in a way that yields real products. And if that case can be made, then we have a basis for spending the effort to move forward, talk to the DP, find a site, etc. So just very quickly, I believe, Graham, I believe both samples have been sent off island, or are they about to be? What's the status?
They were supposed to be sent off today. I haven't had confirmation that they were, but.
Okay, so, and again, if anyone knows vendors who would be willing to participate in this type of trial where the town could send them samples and they would respond with results from the test, that would be of great interest, because the more data we can get on this type of emerging technology, the more interest we would have in, and the better case we might make in doing something like this on the island, the better we'd understand what the possibilities are. So not to spend a whole lot of time on this, but the process is moving forward. Questions? Okay, and the third slide, which is again something we talked about last time. I don't have a picture, but again, phases 1A, B, and C of the landfill are still under closure order from DEP. The closure schedule is indefinite. It's been suspended by DEP, in part because there's a PFAS assessment, in part because DEP has indicated they'd like to see if, depending on the results of various testing, one of the options would be for the island to actually encase some of the PFAS material that's on the site within the landfill closure mound. This is all very preliminary, and the assessments process is just beginning, but it is moving forward, and we'll talk about it more in a future workshop. I think the other part here is that there are other ways to design the cover that might reduce cost. There's interest in recovering sand from existing stockpiles, which might reduce the cost from the town. And then there's a question to start thinking about now, which is, you have a landfill mound that's closed, what might be an appropriate post-closure use? Is it appropriate for solar panels? Is it appropriate for something else? It's something to think about before the closure process has a timeline on it, rather than when there's time sensitivity. So I'm just putting these points out there to know that efforts on these areas are beginning now. It's a lot of work ahead of us, and we'll talk about them at a future workshop, not this one, but I didn't want to leave it untouched, this point, just to touch everyone's memory and to remember that this is an issue. And to put a little context on it, the most recent estimate to close phase 1 ABC in the landfill was in the range of $14 million. So given that cost, it's definitely worth a great deal of care and understanding if there are options to reduce costs, to contain costs, to reduce risks associated with the closure process. Questions on that? So those are the brief updates, and we can get back to some of these points later. But at this point, I think I'll turn it back to Graham to talk about waste reduction.
Thank you, George. So the next couple slides, Brian went over. So here we can see, just as a reminder, we have a $2 million increase in the operating budget alone for SWEF. That does not include personnel. So as Brian pointed out, a lot of this is can be accounted for with the disposal costs that we're seeing continually increase, and also in line with the current waste services agreement. The next slide is the capital requests as well, which we spoke about. From here, we're going to jump into development of the waste reduction plan on the next slide. And these next several slides will be more discussion based, so be ready. I look forward to hearing your thoughts as we work through this. At the last workshop, in light of the state solid waste plan and in support of the board's strategic plan and its environmental leadership goal. The board expressed interest in setting waste reduction goals. These goals set locally can, of course, be formed around a variety of different outcomes. The amount of waste generated, landfill disposal, toxicity, carbon footprint, litter, and leaks in our waste management systems, and financial costs, of course, which we've talked a little bit about already. So maybe we can leave this up just so we can, we have these in front of us, these different areas around which goals can be set. But I'd like to have a little conversation, I guess, and hear from the board about which areas are of most and least concern, which should be turned into quantifiable goals. Is there anything missing that you would like to see included that's not captured in any of these potential goals?
It's Matt. Hello.
Matt.
Hey, my thought is whatever we do should mesh with whatever our future plans are. So, it doesn't do any good to try to reduce, I don't know, pick on something, plastic, if we're going to be using plastic as feedstock to make electricity. So I really think it'd be hard for me to pick, I agree with reduced toxicity and, and groundwater flow, things like that we've been trying to do anyway. But I think until we have a clear path on what is the right thing to do there, I think it's hard to, I don't want to be picking something that will be not meshing and going against eventually what we want to do.
Well, I can follow up on that, Matt. So I guess this question is for Graham and George. Could it also, are you looking for direction here to help figure out what the end goal is? I mean, I think it can go both ways, Matt. We probably need to talk about both sides of it.
Yes, in part. This can fit in both to, a waste reduction plan, which is more focused on smaller aspects in some ways, or it could fit into the larger 2025, post-2025 plan as well. Waste reduction will be continuous throughout that. So I appreciate your point, Matt. But if we're also thinking about carbon footprint, perhaps we also consider the energy of bringing all those plastics over. I'm just being devil's advocate right now. But in terms of that is boat space, that is other thing. But I appreciate your point about how that does mesh in the future. So with that caveat in that, we don't know exactly right now what the future holds for solid waste management on the island. We have the next few years. What are your thoughts? What do we form our intermediate goals around?
I have a question. Can you explain, just give me some examples of the difference between the first two?
Sure. So waste quantities, I can even pull up right now. Sorry for the noise. So when we think about waste quantities, it could be any type of waste, from mattresses to tires to, invasive plants, maybe. It could be glass, it could be leafing yard waste, which we see an abundance of. And there's different challenges with each of these in their own ways. And landfill disposal is specifically for what goes into a landfill. So as a reminder, on Nantucket, the only thing landfilled is contamination that goes into the composter. So for local landfill disposal, reducing that would be that, the residuals, the contamination. And if we're thinking about landfill disposal off island, we're thinking the non-recycled, non-compostable waste and the C&D waste specifically. So the reason why landfill disposal is specifically called out is that's when you think about the hierarchy of waste management, landfill disposal is the worst. Besides littering is probably at the very bottom of the very worst thing we can do for the environment, for ourselves, the One Health model. Landfill is next. Landfill disposal is next after that. And at the top is to not create it, right? Not create waste to start with. So among that continuum, that's why we focus on potentially landfill disposal.
Okay, so second one's a little more drilled down, specific for going in the landfill and for being shipped off island.
Right. And or you, if it's the board's interest mainly just to focus locally, it could be that. Or if we're thinking more from a social justice perspective, it could just be what's shipped off island. You know, it doesn't have to encompass it all if it doesn't speak to the board.
Yeah, if I can add, there's a basic trade-off here. Well, first of all, anything that's shipped off island at this point is going to add all that transportation cost plus the whims of the market in places where it actually is sent to for disposal. So that it's not like these are necessarily independent criteria. There are always going to be groups of things that happen, but I think so. I think that's one point. A second point is that, and I'm going to go back to what Matt said, because he's absolutely right in terms of you don't want to undermine a feedstock that you might find a use for on the island. On the other hand, I guess I don't know that we know exactly what the challenges will be of siting a new facility on the island to handle anything, even if it's small. But our sense has been that siting these types of facilities anywhere, and especially in a place as sensitive to the environment as Nantucket, is going to have its challenges. And to the extent we could get by with something that's smaller and more focused, rather than a general purpose machine that takes everything, we may be better off and more successful in making the case to the community that this is a facility that ought to be developed on. And I think that, you know, that's another trade-off is if part of this goes into, you know, if you're going to look at the size of the budget that's coming, if you look at getting community acceptance for facilities, what are you doing in order to minimize those demands on resources and in terms of facilities, and to the extent you can reduce waste and make the need for those smaller, you've met that requirement. So I think that's a second part here, which is that to the extent that you don't make waste or you find a way to reuse or divert it from disposal, then the demand for those other services will be reduced and the cost of them will be reduced. So again, we don't have numbers here, which might make it an easier picture to see. On the other hand, there's a lot of chicken and egg in this analysis, and so we're looking, frankly, for guidance on what seems right, what seems possible, what seems like the right road to go down.
I have a question. What do you, George and Graham, what do you think should happen in 3 years? Looking at you guys, if you know the numbers, what do you think? You know, should we be doing a digester and only putting good ingredients in so we get something positive out of it, and then, you know, and then doing some alternative with the remainder? What's the, you know, what does your gut tell you right now?
My gut says we need to use these next 3 years, and we don't have all of 3 years because we need to make a decision before then. But we need to use every second we have to gather as much data as possible to understand how, in the best possible situation, basically, or the worst, understanding the circumstances, how the composter, for instance, in this case, could perform in our community. We know we've had some major challenges with that. The compost quality has increased and it's much better quality now. But, you know, PFAS, of course, is a concern. So the slide George showed with, you know, removing biosolids and seeing the PFAS drop just in those preliminary tests, that's a good, you know, a good sign. And that says maybe, you know, the composter could be a reality here. But we need to see if it actually could. And part of that's, you know, one, can we get its quality compost that meets whatever standards DEP is going to set? The other part is the product marketable?
Yeah.
You know, what does it take to get the compost to be something that the community wants? Does it need to just be food waste going in there? What is that the community needs? Because it doesn't make any sense to do composting if you don't have a place to put that compost. So that's just with the compost, right? And we can go through the same thing with all the other facilities too. And, you know, our current waste management system. The colored bag is another way that we've been talking about getting at some of this information that we need to see how we can optimize our current system and see where the challenges lie, to see what's the best next step.
A follow-up, Jason? So
Yeah.
Graham, in that case, if that's, I look and say, okay, if that's the goal is to have good inputs, then shouldn't our time in the next year or two be on either colored bags or brown paper bags that are compostable and food scraps only going in? You know, shouldn't we should be designing, I'm just asking the question, shouldn't that be what we're designing then?
There are a lot of different ways to go about that, right? And it's not just with the composter. There's a lot of things, you know, with the MRF, for instance, we could go about the recyclables, for instance, in a very different way. So part of this is to see, you know, what are the priorities of the goal of the board with these goals. You know, if toxicity is not a concern of the board, which is not what I heard from you, Matt, right now, but just as an example, then it's going to show that certain programs and initiatives for waste reduction of toxicity is less important. You know, how important is money, for instance, the SWEF budget and capital requests and all of that for this? Do we want to put a big investment now to figure some of this stuff out, or are we, you know, with the additional 2 million alone for this coming year in the operating budget, is that too much already?
Yeah. Okay. Let me jump in with maybe stepping back a little bit. I mean, waste reduction is it's the holy grail. It's a great thing to do, but everybody who tries it seems to move fairly slowly. It's a hard thing to do because it typically involves changing systems, changing behavior, and you need a lot of cooperation and a lot of pieces moving together to get that done. So, you know, I think, you know, we have to, first of all, it's to take a bit of boldness. I mean, a colored bag program is a big step. Material bans or new ordinances, and some of them, you know, may be new. They're big steps. So it's going to be hard to predict how well they'll work and how quickly they'll take hold, how much resistance they may, they may be received with. On the other hand, you know, bold measures are needed to keep the budget under control and to you know, and to make a difference in terms of the other criteria of toxicity and carbon footprint, et cetera. I think so. This is a hard problem. It's not something that we've seen a lot of successes in terms of other communities. We've seen some. I mean, pay as you throw and adding fees and making an economic incentive to reduce waste has worked in other places, and it's not being done here. So that's something that's on the list. We are, in my view, we ought to be looking at very, very carefully. And how do we roll it out to get the response that we wanted and to somehow make it into, you know, an island-wide community problem that's seen as a positive move rather than as as something that for which there would be resistance. A legitimately difficult problem, especially in Nantucket, where there are, you know, seasonals and visitation make up so much of the sources of materials. But again, these are hard challenges and it's going to take some boldness to get through them. I think when I look at the list, I tend to look at the top of the list, and maybe we should go to the next slide, Graham, because we can start seeing the methods that you know, that are tried. I mean, what can you do through command and control, just banning a material, or what can you do through incentives? Where can you get people to volunteer to actually make a difference, or where do you need the mandate? These are difficult questions, and you know, I think that's something we're looking at. Guidance is how much, you know, what sort of action by government would be accepted, and how do we set that up so that it is accepted, in what context we move it forward. And so I'd ask those questions as well.
And perhaps it does help to think about it as Jason, posed the question, is this pertaining to just a waste reduction program and goals, or is this also 2025 post, what our waste management system might look like post 2025? Because those same questions do exist. Do we want to do what's absolutely cheapest right now for waste management? Do we want to, I hear that your strategic goal for solid waste is environmental leadership. Where do those priorities fall? And that's where a lot of these questions fall. And so I'll give you a little background what I've been working on with George and with others as well. There's a lot of different ways to reduce waste, a lot of different initiatives that can be that we could use. And for years, Nantucket has been at the forefront of sustainable waste management. So that's been a really wonderful thing to be a part of. From the composting to the biodegradable packaging bylaw and the single-use plastics ban, the landfill diversion here, water refill stations for source reduction, and then of course all the community-led initiatives from the citizen warrant articles that ended up being bylaws, the community farm, for instance, clean team litter derby, and even the initiation of our municipal recycling program. So there's a lot to celebrate here. But we also, of course, have to continue moving forward and also planning for our future with solid waste. So we have developed a list of different waste reduction initiatives that have been, identified by the EPA, Mass DEP, and are in progress in other communities. And also keeping an eye to the specifics of waste management here on Nantucket. So I have a list of about 50 or so different initiatives, and we've ranked them in their impacts, their potential impacts in the following different categories, from landfill diversion, source reduction, toxicity, to local receptivity and economic impacts. So the question is, which of these are most important for you? So we're working on a weighted matrix. So once we put in, how these rank in priority for you all, the beautiful Excel will, spit out different priorities of the programs based on your priorities with this. And we can look from there. It's more of a scientific, data-driven way of, identifying programs that could be a good start for us as we work towards waste reduction and 2025. And these, affect all across the board, as examples from C&D salvage to, deconstruction bylaws, to fees on disposable items. So some of these might not have a lot of local receptivity. Some of them might be very popular. And some of them might be more effective or less effective in different ways. Do you have any questions about the process so far before we jump into where your priorities are, given the different trade-offs that always exist in this?
Matt, did you raise your hand there? You getting ready to?
I hope someone else speaks up, but I will in a second. I'll give you guys a chance. I'm sorry.
I don't know if I'm jumping the gun here, Graham. When I look at this list in front of us on page 10, and the one on page 9, like, we want to do them all. They're all great. So I don't think Matt or anybody here is just trying to put it right back on you. We think they're all great. If they're effective, let's do them. You prioritize them. You're the expert. So I can see why people feel that way. One thing I would think about how to prioritize these is, let's say if they're all pretty equal in impact. So if it's high impact and it has a low, what's the word I'm looking for? It doesn't take a lot of people to implement, right? It's a system or it's a piece of equipment, because finding staff and finding more people to do any of this, it's probably not going to be the option in the next 5 or 10 years, if ever. So I think that's something else we got to think about. We could put a new program in, it could be highly impactful, but it's going to take 5 more positions over the next 5 years. I'm using an extreme. Then I would put that at the bottom, just because it takes more people. Just something
Okay, I thank you for sharing that, Jason. I'm gonna ask a couple questions just for clarity.
Sure.
High in impact for you, is that any type of impact, including landfill diversion, source reduction, toxicity, or are any of those more important to you? Or economic impacts, you know?
It's so hard to look at, like, what could be more important than toxicity reduction, right? If you have a family, you don't want anybody to be sick, right? Or cancer or anything with PFAS. And then, but if you're doing clean team every day and you're seeing the litter, that is the highest impact for you, because you're just seeing trash flying around everywhere. So I know this is our job to prioritize these type of things. I really can't pick, I couldn't number these 1 through 7.
Okay, Matt, if I could just ask one more clarifying question to Jason about what he said previously, is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry. And then low staff, you talked about the challenges of staff and, everything that goes with that, from housing to funding. Equipment is great. The challenge with waste reduction is usually equipment is not the way we go about it. What are your thoughts on policies and regulations? How does that fit into, not necessarily staff time so much, but also not physical equipment?
I think that's the best effect the select board can have, is putting in regulations and policies that are going to have the highest impact, knowing that they're not all going to work, right? Because there's humans involved and there's behavior involved, and not every system is we're gonna nail it here. But we know that we had one of the best recycling systems in the country at one time. So we've been there before, we can do it again. So I think that's the best way that we can take your recommendations, and you and George and anybody else that has the expertise, and put policy around it, which I know this is exactly why we're meeting and what you're asking. But yeah, policy is the way we can do it.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Matt, I think you have things to say. I'm sorry.
No, I maybe this is just, I'm probably pretty, common sense and simplistic. I decide, I think what I'm going to do with my business, and I figure out the steps, and then we as a team figure out how to do it. But we have a goal in mind. And I think what we're missing here is we don't have a goal. I think the public will support the changes that are necessary if we know what those are. So if we work backwards, I think we're trying to sort of build it. We're trying to build it, in my mind, the way I work, this is backwards. If you said what we want to do is get people to reduce waste and, not put anything toxic into the digester, et cetera, then we could figure out how to do that. And, but to say what's more important, that or this, or what, I just feel like it'd be like if you went to a doctor and the doctor asked me, how do I want to treat my illness? Oh, here, there's a different, you have to explain what the options are and why the options are good, what the choices are. And so I kind of feel as though and I don't think that any of us on this board, and I've been at this for 20 years, I don't think any of us on this board are, we can help with this. We aren't the specialists. That was part of the problem we did the first time. We picked something and it was sold to the public as this wonderful thing, but it really didn't do what it was sold to us as. That waste digester never did what we were told it was going to do. And so, we've kind of got we feel good, and we have sort of, in my opinion, sort of fake numbers, and so anyway, what's the right, where do we want to end up? And if we know where we want to end up, then we can figure out what policies, what programs, short-term and long-term, what choices to make to get there. And I
I
don't
could-
think we want to figure out what choices we want to, which ones do you want to do? You know, and Jason makes a really good point about staffing. We don't have, you know, we have to work under the constraints of having little staff. When all this first started, the recycling and everyone was excited about it, it's sort of like the clean team is now. People were out at the dump doing the sorting. You know, there was an excitement and a, you know, oh, we're all going to save the world together. And slowly those people aged out or, you know, found other things and it became the town's responsibility. But I think, you know, we have to build that excitement again over a program to get everyone on board. And it needs to fit within how our haulers work, how our island works, the seasonality, you know, so I think, you know, we all know what those issues are. We need to know, here are our choices, A, B, and C. These are the things we think will work. Then we could tell you whether we could get there or not.
Matt, I couldn't agree more with you about setting goals. And so if we, Erica, if we quickly just jump back to the previous slide, that's what we're really trying to get out there. What's important, which goals, you know, I didn't want to put numbers, but we could say, you know, reduce landfill disposal by 50% by X date. Again, you said you didn't last meeting, you all were talking about how you need to know what would go into it to get you there to that goal, just that, you know, attainable goals. But understanding, are all of these areas where you want to see Nantucket setting goals? Are some things more important than others? You know, how much do we care about the SWEF budget? You know, we can ask Brian to not listen real quick. Or, you know, do we care about our carbon footprint? You know, there's no right or wrong answer to any of these. There are and there aren't. It depends on, you know, what perspective you're coming from. And so that's where we turn to our leadership to get answers. You know, you all, the community has faith in each and every one of you. That's why you are in the position you are. And I've not been elected to select board. So I can't, you know, I don't have that same faith, I guess, from the community. So that's why I'm turning to you as spokespeople for the community and where you see these priorities lie.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, Libby, then Wilson, yeah.
I just was going to say, I think if we go, I don't think the board has enough information yet, Graham, to make any determinations on which of these things that they want to pursue. They want to pursue all of them. We all do. But what are they going to take to do that? So as we go through here a little bit more, I think we're starting to get into, like on slide 11, what types of things are going to be needed in order to accomplish those things. And these are just things we've talked about. The board needs to know a lot more about exactly how they would work, what they would require, what potential costs might be, I think, in order to be informed enough to make any policy determinations. So I think we've gotten a little farther since our November workshop here. But I don't think we're quite ready, or the board can speak for themselves, but I don't know that they're quite ready to say, okay, let's reduce landfill disposal and reduce toxicity, forget about the carbon footprint for now and reduction of litter. I don't think it's realistic to expect them to pick any of that right at the moment.
I don't expect them to pick anything, but to have a better sense of what if we're barking up the right tree is, I guess, helpful. And there's, you know, I have at least 50 different programs that we could put forth. And again, as I've been hearing from you all, you don't feel like you have the knowledge to decide if any individual one of these programs would be good for the community. And that's why we were thinking about going through with a ranking system, a weighted matrix to figure it out based on where your priorities might lie. If we can, jump back to the last slide, just for some clarity, perhaps. Local receptivity.
Sorry, Greg, can we go to Melissa and Don? They might have something.
Oh, sorry.
What you just said.
Well, I want to just clarify one thing that I think was misunderstood. So local receptivity, that's how important is it to you all and to the town, I guess, for any of these programs that the community is 100% behind it, or might have a hard time. You know, pay as you throw has been one of those things that I think doesn't have great local receptivity. So that's kind of what I'm listening for feedback for.
Thanks, Graham. I thought you were moving on to a new thing, and I was like, no, wait for Melissa and Don. Okay, Melissa, then Don.
Well, thank you, Jason. I think Libby actually said everything that I was thinking and feeling. That, you know, to me, these are all aspirational, and they should be. And on their face, I can't evaluate which one is of greater priority to the community without understanding all of the intricate details that go behind each one. You just mentioned, Graham, the pay as you throw and the community being a little icy about that, but I'm not sure that concept has been vetted to the point where we really understand the, you know, benefits, the challenges, the costs, all of the things around it. So not to, you know, be redundant, but I'm not prepared to say which one of these things are more important to me until I can start to see what the substance is and what the impact is. And then I think the next thing is, if we believe through substantive conversation and analysis that something is really the right thing for the community, it's our responsibility to have that conversation with the community and constituents about why it's important to do that. So it's too difficult for me today to say, you know, let's forget I don't know, I think I saw something else. Let's forget landfill diversion because economic impacts are a higher priority. To be honest, I don't even know what that means. So that's my comment for now.
Sounded really smart though, Melissa.
Don.
That's my witching, Matt.
I agree with what's been said, and just what I wanted to add was that as we evaluate them, I mean, it's going to be very important to see the viability. How many resources are we going to have to put into getting a particular program off the ground, and how locally receptive is it going to be? I want to make sure that as we prioritize, like we're doing throughout all of town government with our limited resources, that we do the most impactful things, the things that are going to get the best results. And everything on this list is a good thing to be looking at.
Okay, thank you for your feedback. I appreciate it. Based on what I'm hearing, and I'd appreciate hearing from you all if this sounds like a good next step. And I'm not sure the best way to share it. If I were to share all of these different programs, which are ranked with, you know, the diversion potential, you know, the source reduction potential, you know, how much of an impact the town has. Is it completely in the town's hand, like a contract, or is it completely outside of the town's hands? We're leaving it up to, if it depends on individuals' behavior change, for instance, receptivity, staff time, what it would take fiscally to achieve. Would you want to review each one of these programs? It's about 50 programs in a spreadsheet. Would that be the next step? So you can look at each one of these. That's what was coming to mind when I was hearing Melissa and then Dawn speak.
Graham, can I jump in here?
Sure.
There is another way to do it, which is, I'm hearing that there's a lot of information here. It's not obvious what the interconnections are at this stage. And I think maybe what we need to do as staff is put together some packages or bundles and say, hey, here's one set of programs that might get us to this point, and here's another set that maybe emphasizes something else, and put out a couple of sample bundles that would make the discussion more concrete, perhaps, and look at the trade-offs than to just, you know, put all the programs at once. Would say, you know what, let's do a pay as you throw, and while we're doing that, let's support it with an exchange, and we'll do, but we're worried that pay as you throw won't cover this. We're just going to suggest a new waste ban at the local level on that. And if we have 3 or 5 or something like that as a package, and then people could start to see trade-offs and give us to move away from this to that and, sort of react to the package, and that might be more helpful. I'm seeing one thumb up. So I hope that's a good sign. So I'll stop now and get some discussion.
Ken, are you raising your hand? Fingers?
I am. Just a question, George. What we're looking at is a situation where one option is to tweak existing strategies, and another option might be to look at alternate or new technologies as a way. Are we constrained in the sense of that there's not much out there in terms of alternate technologies, or is it really because of our isolation and our location and the ability to get all of us getting stuff off the island, that we're really only down to one possibility in terms of tweaking and improving existing strategies that we've been doing? I'm just not clear in terms of where your and Graham's thought process is coming from relative to that.
So I'll take the first shot at it, and then Graham come at me. First of all, yeah, being offshore at a limited scale is a challenge for a lot of projects. But I think when we're talking about purely waste reduction, ultimately at its core, we're talking about having people change behavior, changing purchase choices, and changing how they use things, and even styles, or what's popular or what's practiced in some areas, and that's difficult. So that I think the question is, another way to state the question in waste reduction world is, what can a town do to change the behavior of its citizens in a way to achieve a specific goal? And that's a very difficult question, but you can send an economic signal. That's what pay as you throw does. You can make absolute prohibitions, be it single bags or what have you. And then the question is, what mix of measures is going to end up with the town residents and visitors leveraging off the goal and say, aha, this is something we want to do. And they're going to come up with ideas that we can't come up with either. And, from the grassroots, and to stimulate that sort of grassroots response, which is the idea of all these programs. And then the question is, what signal you send to people so they respond in ways that are helpful? So, that's why I'm thinking of bundles. If you go up bundle pay as you throw with some other things that are more incentive, that are more, positive, exchanges. And I'm not exactly sure what this looks like, because frankly, there aren't a lot of people out there doing this well. And we are blazing some new ground here when we talk about waste reduction. But I mean, so I don't know if that's helpful, but it gives you some idea of what we're up to next and what we're trying to do. But most of what we're trying to do here is change behavior.
I guess part of my question was with the fact that lots of places around the world don't want to accept garbage anymore. What's happening with the approach to a way to, in fact, get rid of it, as opposed to trying to dump it on somebody else through technology or through different methods of incineration or whatnot? It's just a question. I have no clue as to what direction that takes us.
Well, I think I'll answer. If you look at the solid waste master plan, Mass DP, I think, has set a waste reduction goal of 90% by 2050. I think the industry looks at that and says that's not realistic, and that you're trying to will something into being that's just not going to happen. And what you're seeing now is in Massachusetts has become an exporter of waste for remote facilities. They're sending waste to Ohio. They're sending waste to upstate New York in rural areas where there's less population, and there are facilities that can be sited with a lot of buffer area, and people in local governments want to make the money off it. They're now looking at North Alabama as a source for Massachusetts waste. This is, not the way we'd like to go, but I think it represents to some extent a failure in policy in not being able to change behavior so that we can either use less or find ways to recover and put things back into the economy under the materials. That's why we're looking at, hey, wouldn't it be great to turn plastic into diesel fuel or electricity, because those are things that the island imports, and if we can make them out of waste, we would cut off those pieces of the loop locally. Nantucket doesn't have a manufacturing base, so that's not in our conversation, but to the extent you could find ways to feed a manufacturing base, at least on the mainland in New England or even in mid-Atlantic, then maybe you've done something better than shipping it even further away. So I think, what we're seeing is a very different problem. And frankly, the state has not been doing well at it. And I think that's part of the struggle here. There's no shame in struggling with a difficult problem. The hard part is finding the solution that's going to work.
Thank you.
Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, again, I go back to Georgia. What do we want to see in 5 years? Do we want to have a gasification plant out making electricity? C&D is probably still going to be shipped off. Maybe there's a market for plastic then, like what is it we want to see? And then we can get there. If we have to do pay as you go, people will do it. I'm not so, or if you bring out clean waste or clean inputs for the composter, you don't get charged. And if it comes out mixed, you get charged. I think people would adjust. But what is it we want to see? I'm with you. If we could turn plastic and old tires that are buried out there or whatever, if we could turn that into electricity, we'd be all over that. But I worry that what we're talking about are programs leading to what? I think people are going to need to know, what is it we're doing at the landfill and why are we doing it? And how do these programs, it will do us no good to talk about these programs and tick a box on there until we know what the final solution is.
So getting clean streams, like reducing toxicity, that's one way to think about reducing toxicity, as you're talking about, Matt. Just having clean food waste go into the composter as an example. The cleanest streams that we can get, it's going to open the doors for possibilities for any type of technology, from composting to gasification. One of the challenges with the pilots that we've been sending samples off for, that George was talking about at the beginning, is we don't know if the technology can handle our dirty plastics, essentially. That's the challenge, because it's contaminated by food waste. So if we can get really clean streams, that really opens the door to us. I'll open up to George too.
No, I think we've covered a lot of the points here, and I think waste reduction to some extent is maybe the hardest discussion to have, because it's perhaps the most abstract and starting from the most abstract place. And we do want to cover the other two topics, but this has been helpful, at least to get responses. And Matt, you're absolutely right. I mean, you have to say, hey, in 5 years, we'd love to be to the place where we still have a composter, everything goes into it, turns into compost, so there's almost no residual. That to the extent we can, we're taking things that otherwise would have been contaminants, separating them and making, diesel fuel or electricity or whatever we can make on island from them. And nothing goes off island but the leftovers, the things that can't reasonably be handled here. So we have a couple of, higher level principles, and maybe we need to do a better job of, showing what that looks like and how we need to get there.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, George. I think you kind of know it. I think you need to, it reminds me, I did a computer program back when there weren't computer programs, and one of the best grades I ever had in college, except I didn't have the overarching program that talked to everything. And so it was, I think you guys know where you want to be, and I think we have to work back from that a little bit. If that makes sense.
Yes.
So
And it is.
yeah, I would say George and I both. Sorry, go ahead.
Real quick question. When I hear about dirty plastics, do people take, large bathtubs and just spray down everything? Is there a way to just clean all that up so that you can then chew it up into pellets or something and send it off? Like, is there anything like that we could be doing?
The wastewater is really challenging with that, but specifically with the dirty plastics, I was referring to the contamination going into the composter. So that's that. And the simple option, the simple, way to get rid of that is for that to not go into the composter to start with. That's the solution right there. That's the simple solution. So I think for the large part, George and I probably have an idea of what we would like to see, but we didn't want to put our own goals and, behind that, our own goals for the town behind that in terms of what we see for waste reduction and so forth. But
Graham,
we can put things together.
I don't think they're your own. I think they are recommendations to the board.
They are there. I don't have any agenda in any of this. My agenda is what's best for the town. And, I'm a taxpayer too. So I want to see, my taxpayer dollars being spent in a good way for the benefit of the community and not for the benefit of any business or anything or personal interest or anything like that. It's for the best of our community.
Yeah, but I do think the discussion's been helpful. I think, it is a hard thing to get our arms around. So the feedback is helpful. And I think it's incumbent on us to come back with you with maybe some packages of suggestions of individual goals and programs that are maybe make this less abstract and then we can see, if this sounds good, if it sounds like we're on the right path, or if there's something we just can't see that you can see, that will help redirect it somewhere.
So we'll jump ahead. We looked at the next slide briefly, so we'll jump ahead, and this is getting towards some of what I was hearing. The next slide, please, Erica. Some of what I was hearing from you all about next steps to help us get ready for 2025 and the decisions that need to be made. So for the MRF, the Materials Recovery Facility, we're working on some upgrades, as you heard in the Capitol presentation. Most excitingly, so the drop-off area, we're looking at a third catwalk. We have installation. All of this is pending town meeting vote, and an upgrade to the sorting station and a bag breaker. The bag breaker specifically will give us the opportunity to open commingled bagged recyclables that we receive from the haulers. This is currently going off with the NERNIC at a cost to the town, and by being able to recycle it properly and getting it baled on island with the rest of our drop-off recyclables, we'll see some new opportunities open there for the town. And then upcoming that we'd like to see as capital requests in the next year or two are some automation, automated sorting improvements to the MRF sorting room. Currently, it's just a conveyor belt going through and people are hand picking off. So as an example, an eddy current separator could pull off non-ferrous, or it could help with separating the non-ferrous metals from the ferrous metals. And a third baler for paper relates to PFAS and ultimately the composter, whether we can get PFAS levels low enough so that, once DEP sets a standard and maybe the community has a standard, I don't know, we can see if the composter is feasible in the future, as well as if we can market the compost as well. So that's the goal there with getting a third baler for the paper, but it also means we have another waste stream. So that is something that would have less local receptivity, going back to what we were talking about earlier. So something to keep in mind there, but it gives us the plus sides of it would be probably a much cleaner compost stream and probably most likely less PFAS in the compost as well. But we would need to see the data on that once that would come to fruition. And jumping ahead to the colored bag pilot program, we are finalizing a scope of services, and I want to get some feedback from you all in a second about that. We're thinking about a 6-week period of the pilot program collection with a pre-pilot to collect just a starting point for data. And we're looking at Sconset as a community to do it. And we've heard some interest from the Civic League there. And so that's about 900 households. And there are 14 businesses in Sconset. So we've talked to Brian about developing a procurement strategy, and we have 3 potential vendors identified. So that's a great start on that. And George helped with beginning hauler outreach as well. So always more to go there as we proceed. Next slide, please. So my questions for you is kind of what sorting protocol makes sense. And I know you're going to push it back to us too, to a certain degree, but this is kind of what we're looking at. Obviously, separating out non-recyclable, non-compostable, the NERNIC, from the compostable streams probably makes the most sense in trying to see that was the whole originating idea behind this. How clean can we get the compost in that sense? And would this work for separating these two streams out with the haulers and their stake body trucks? Then we also just talked about paper. So colored bag pilot could also be a great opportunity to pull paper out of going into the composter. And of course, that would need to go into its own stream. It couldn't go, obviously we want to pull it out of the composter, but it also couldn't go into the NERNIC because it is required by DEP to be recycled if it's not getting composted here. And then the other one would be to separate plastics and aluminum. So plastics and aluminum are typically, if you've been to the drop-off, they go into separate areas, separate chutes at the MRF. And so that makes the sorting operation in the MRF much more simple. You can think about just one, it's just plastics going across the conveyor belt. So it's just the little bits of contamination you pull off. Whereas when the haulers recyclables come in, it's mixed plastic and aluminum. And so the sorting operation is very different when it goes up there. So with the bag breaker opening the haulers recyclables, we would have that opportunity there. Do we want to separate out, that would, if we separate out all those things, we're looking at compostable waste, we're looking at NERNIC, tin aluminum, plastics, and paper and glass. So that's 6 streams plus cardboard, which wouldn't go into a bag. 6 streams too much. I know I heard from the community when we added the 1 stream, space in people's households was an issue in their businesses and so forth. I know, housing is a challenge here and every little space counts. So it's a bit of a balancing act to figure out how far do we want to go with the colored bag pilot and how much do we think people would be, willing to support with as well, the local receptivity. What are your thoughts on that?
Mr. Chairman, I don't want to interrupt your thoughts, but I think, Graham, that the board needs a little bit more layout of this. They don't know right now. I can't even name back to you all the streams that you just mentioned that we might be considering sorting. I think we need to show them, more visually. Here are the streams that come in. Here's what is reasonable to be combined. Here's what isn't. We could have a maximum of whatever the number of colored bags is. Here's what would be easy. Here's what would be most difficult, and lay out some scenarios for them, because I don't know that we can ask them these questions right now and have them make reasonable answers that make sense without showing them a little bit more information here. I could be wrong about that, but I don't think I can do it.
Yeah, Libby, I think we'd have to have so many questions just from this slide and without, visuals, and it was complicated before, not understanding some of the lingo. And this is a little more detailed color bag pilot program. I think we could get into this, but I think we'd have to, kind of what Libby said. All right, ideally 6 color bags would be amazing. That'd be the best, but is it realistic? 3 is not going to be great for the outcomes, but human behavior can handle that. That kind of stuff kind of laid out, and then we can, pick through your recommendations, because we trust you all. We want to, and if you, what we call recommendations, or here's kind of what we're thinking, we can ask questions and drill down. And then our job is to back it, to sell it, to put policy around it, to talk about it every other Wednesday night and drive it like we did housing, like we've done other things with our strategic plan, and everything will kind of follow suit, right? With financial and capital program committee and this directive from the departments. So I agree with what Libby just said. Does that make sense? What I said, Libby, about I'm trying to follow the strategic plan model, thinking like Mike Burns, in a sense, like we said, oh, we kind of want to do this, and he would come up with kind of a range, like kind of impossible, maybe possible, where do you want to go? And we would kind of land on certain areas, and then we would back it and put it in to writing and run with it.
Yeah, I do think that. I mean, the more streams, the cleaner the waste that's going into the compost is going to be, but also the more complicated it's going to be for the public.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we'll back whatever George and Graham, what everybody, what they come up with. And then we can put language around it and put policy and regulations around it and help drive it.
We may want to get this, Madigan, may want to get to 6 bags someday, but maybe we do 1 yellow bag with, you know, with clean waste in it that can be, you know, and see how that goes. You know, it's sort of like we may build into, okay, that works. And everyone has a yellow bin now, and they all know what that means, and they have them in the restaurants, and they have them in their houses, or green bin, whatever color it is. But now we'll add this. You know, if there's a market for some sort of metal, then maybe we all start doing that. I mean, I just think in the future, anyway.
So going back to the original goal of the colored bag pilot, right? It was to separate out compostable waste from NERNIC, right? Do we just want to do that, or do we also want to add paper? I would say that would be our next goal with the, you know, the concerns with PFAS. Or do we just keep it simple and just do NERNIC and compostable waste separated, and compostable waste being food and paper mixed?
I think you can keep paper separate. People already do that. They do blue buckets in their businesses with the paper. You could add another color. Everyone I know that's trying to do it right has got paper, plastic, and metal. And then they've got the garbage in the garbage can. And so I think if you added one more thing to that and said, you're going to have less garbage because, you know, less going into your garbage because you're going to put all your compostable in a different thing. It's going to cost you about the same. It's going to be 2 pickups. Most people would do that. So, you know, so I don't think you have to go backwards on the paper part. You know what I mean? They're already used to the first 3.
So paper for most people is going in with their food waste and the rest of their trash. We don't have a paper recycling.
This is Melissa. I was going to say that, you know, I think it's surprising to some people that we're not separating paper. And I think we did at one time then stopped and said it can go into compostable. So I do think there's some confusion with folks, and some people are like, oh, no, I can put that in the compostable. You know, my aspiration is for 6 bags. I like easing the community into it, because I think what we don't want to do is come out with something and you know, this is science, so it's going to have to change and evolve as we are building these programs, but you know, in 2 years change it again, and say no, sorry, now you can actually put the paper in the compost, or you know, change it around. So I think if we ease into it, to me the biggest thing is separating out the NERNIC from the compost. People do a good job of recycling plastic, metal, and glass right now and separating that out. I think if we can start to get a handle on getting households and our haulers used to separating NERNIC from compost, that would be a really big accomplishment in a year. And then I think we evaluate the success of it, the cost of it, the impact, and see what more we want to refine. If we feel like we have the latitude in any risk to the environment or to health, or you know, all these other things, by limiting it to just the 2 bags. That's my input.
Thank you both. So we currently hauler families, shall we say, hauler customers have 3 streams. They have trash, the mixed Nernick and compostable, plastics and aluminum combined, and glass. So it sounds like separating out the Nernick and the compostable waste is the next step. So that would be 4 streams. Do we want to leave it there? I was hearing Matt say people are already doing paper. That would be a 5th stream. What are other thoughts on the board with the paper, or should that continue in the compostable stream?
I'm sorry, Graham, could you repeat that one more time for me?
Sure, yeah, sorry. So currently, customers of the haulers have 3 streams currently.
Yeah.
They have the plastics and aluminum combined, they have glass separate, and then they have trash. And the trash is Nernick and compostable waste combined. So it sounds like, going back to the original goal of the colored bag pilot, separating out the Nernick and the compostable waste, taking the trash and splitting it into 2 would be the next step. So that puts us at 4 waste streams, right? Matt was saying that some people are still separating out paper from, years ago. That would put us at a 5th stream. Is that too much? Do we just want to do compostable waste and Nernick? How are you all feeling with the paper?
Don?
I think start with the Nernick. And wait on the paper.
Makes sense to me.
Is paper a PFAS issue now?
Paper is a PFAS issue. That would be the next step for source reduction in the composter.
And that's mainly the shiny stock and the shiny bags, the coated cups, that kind of stuff, right?
Right, a lot of food packaging. We have the biodegradable packaging bylaw and the plastics ban here in Nantucket, which have been great for the island in so many ways, but it's also, when we've switched to paper alternatives rather than reuse, it puts us towards items that contain PFAS. Because we think about PFAS, it's rejecting basically oil and water. It repels those 2. And think about, French fry containers or pizza boxes, or any other host of salad bowls, for instance.
Aluminum cans also have a very thin liner. Every single one is sprayed with some sort of plastic. And if you take the aluminum away, you've got this thin layer of plastic there. So we wonder where all that microplastic is from. Every single can that we think is the best thing ever has got it.
So what I heard from the board overall was that for the colored bag pilot, we should go with separating Nernick and compostable waste, and food and paper should remain together in the compostable waste. Please correct me if I'm mishearing the board.
I'm fine with paper separate, but I'm old. I'm used to it from the old days.
Mr. Chairman, I hate to sound like a broken record, but we need to come back, I think, to the board with some specific recommendations based on these streams that we just talked about, because there are going to be a lot of questions about what is paper. And we need to have descriptions and examples of what exactly we're talking about, and suggestions on how exactly people are going to separate these things. I mean, I can already see panic starting in of where am I going to put all this stuff in my house? As it did previously when we were talking about separating the Nernick out. So maybe we start with paper, Nernick, and whatever the other item was, the compost food waste being all completely separated from each other. But we need to, I think, come back to you with exactly what the items are that we're talking about and how they would be separated. Just a little bit more specifics, and that can be done, I think, relatively quickly, because Graham, you probably have it worked out already in your mind.
Yes, but I am hearing from the board that they want to keep paper in with the compostable waste, unless I'm hearing incorrectly.
I mean, I would say yes, but whatever you suggest, like whatever. I mean,
Yeah, I'm not sure they know the implications of separating it or not separating it.
No, I think it's up to us to take the next shot at it exactly as you suggest. So I mean, we've gotten some great feedback. Let's regroup on it and bring it back.
And then the next question, how important to you all do you think is including businesses in the pilot program? It will increase the costs of it, obviously, but if we're thinking about going island-wide, the recommendation, my recommendation would be to go with businesses, because we need to know how that would affect businesses island-wide. You know, that's the whole idea of doing a pilot, to understand how it would affect the community. Do you see any issues with that initially?
Could we get some volunteer businesses?
I've spoken to a couple that have expressed interest.
We could put that out maybe a little bit more widely and ask for business volunteers. Maybe they get some kind of, I'm not sure where we get the money from, but some kind of stipend to participate.
Yeah, I think that's a good suggestion of Libby. I'd be willing to try it. If my hauler will do it, Graham, I'd willing to try it. I think if you could pick off a couple people in different industries and see how it works for them, that would be great.
And the next question is summer versus fall. Obviously, summer is a big housing crunch time. You know, inviting more people to the island is not necessarily the best. And staffing is, of course, a challenge in the summer. The fall, also, we don't have the big summer rush, and it's not representative of that challenging time on the island in terms of solid waste management. George's and my inkling, based on our conversations, is to go more towards the fall, but we just wanted to hear from you, make sure there's not something really missing from your perspectives, going with the fall rather than the summer.
I'll comment. It would be hard to implement anything in the fall that someone has to do, a business has to do at the, at the end of the middle of the summer or end of the summer. It's almost easier to start it in the early spring and work your way into it than it is to start, everyone's exhausted. You've just been beaten up, and then you're going to add something else when everyone wants to take a break, but can't. So, I kind of think timing wise, spring is better than summer, better than fall. And you certainly can't do it in the summer.
Thanks, Matt. Okay, not hearing anything else. Let's jump to the next slide before I pass this off to George. We wanted to touch back on the Mattakit site and looking at coastal resiliency and flood risk. So right here, what we're looking at is the Massachusetts coast flood risk model at the intermediate high scenario. And this was used in the coastal resilience plan. And it's an advisory map that can be used at different scenarios. But yeah, here we're looking at the intermediate high scenario for the 2050 dynamic flood risk. So while sea level rise and flooding is often evaluated with a bathtub approach where water rises flatly and uniformly, this model, the Massachusetts coast flood model, includes processes associated with storm-induced flooding, such as winds, wave action, wave run-up, storm surge. So it's a full accounting of risk here. So while the DPW campus, as we can see looking here, has between a 2 and 10% risk of flooding during daily high tide by 2050, without any additional mitigation measures, just with as the campus is now. As we can see here, is the waste management site is essentially unaffected. So I just wanted to put this forward, and certainly if you have any questions about the model shown here, the CRAC meeting, the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee, will be meeting tomorrow to discuss that at 10. They're thinking of proposing that to you all instead of the NOAA flood risk model, because it is more of a full accounting of risk. Are there any questions related to this?
I have a question, Graham. Does that include the fact that wetlands are going to expand? Is that factored into this specific picture?
I'm not sure about wetlands expanding, factoring into any of this. Certainly looking at the maps itself, there's certain places where they wouldn't be able to expand given where the landfill mounds are and the mined residuals are. Certainly groundwater is not much of a concern here, based on my conversations with Vince the other week.
But on the groundwater maps, that was my second one. On the groundwater, we'll talk about this at CRAC, I'm sure. On the groundwater maps, just so people understand, the closer you are to the water, the more the groundwater is going to rise, and then it still will impact fairly. It's impacting greatly down in Brant Point. Even if we could stop every bit of water from entering Brant Point, the water's still going to rise there. It was built in a flood. It was built in a wetland. This, I think, is going to be similar. This was Jeremy Swamp was the left side of that, I believe. And I think we reclaimed some of the landfill as reclaimed swamp. And so those areas are very, very likely the water is going to want to go back to where the water used to be. And so we're going to have to, stop that from happening in some way or remove it. And so my hope is as a town, we realize that this landfill is a relatively, 10, 20, 30-year deal, and that we are planning, elsewhere. That my sense on this is that we should be, looking at a 50-year window, 100-year window in finding somewhere at high ground to be running this operation and in the future. So, and I would hope that we would recognize that rather than say, well, it would be cheaper to do it this way, or this is how we do it now, so we better do it how we do it now, or whatever. So I just, hopefully CRAC will take a look at this and come back with a recommendation. And before we do anything, I would like to have sort of engineers and specialists at this give us a full accounting, because it's too important. We don't want to spend 25 million and build a bunch of buildings and then find out that we did the wrong thing.
So groundwater rises with sea level rise, but it takes we have a couple of years after. And looking at this, we don't even have a issue, even with this dynamic flood risk for the site in 2050. So that's, just under 30 years from now, and that's without any mitigation measures put in place. So we're not looking at groundwater being an issue in 2050. Brant Point's in a very different situation and very different elevation than the Mattakit Road site. So, well, yeah, I guess in answer to your question, Matt, about groundwater, it's not counted for in here directly, but the flooding comes first before groundwater rise. So in a way, you can know that it's going to come after it's an issue with flooding.
And this is also a storm tide pathway. Eventually, the water is going to run from one side of the island through to the other side during big storms. And parts of Mattakit are going to be islands. I mean, that's where we're heading. Now that's, 50 years out, 70 years out, but in my kid's lifetime, they're going to see that happen, I bet.
At this point, I'm going to pass it over to George. We can jump to the next slide.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Graham. Okay, it is now 20 to 6, so I'd like to cover some of the subject, but I do appreciate that, some of the longer slides may make difficult to go through. Just real quick review. There's the picture of the landfill site. Let's move to the next slide. And just where the facilities are. And again, we showed these last time, but let's get to what I'd like to talk about, which is the next slide. Okay, last time we had talked or introduced the idea of the question and should the town exercise the option to purchase the composter? There's interested in more information on pros, cons, and cost scenarios to help with the decision. So let's add a little bit more to that process now and again. It's, understanding the time. There's a limit, there's going to be a limit to what we can cover. I did think it was important to actually look at the words of the option and for the board to see that. Just putting straight out there in the terms. And so here's the wording that it comes straight out of the Waste Service Agreement Amendment 4, Amendment 1, Item 4. And it's if an agreement cannot be reached, and that's been on council's opinion that simple extension is not something that can be supported, the town will have the option to purchase the facility for $1 million or fair market value, whichever. So a couple background points. We're talking about November 30th, 2025, which is the target date. Town council is advised that the agreement cannot be extended unless there's a new procurement process and there's approval at town meeting. And what happens if there's no purchase? Well, Waste Options has 180 days to remove the composter, which is what the agreement says. And we all know that if we get to that point, there may be some negotiation about how to interpret exactly what the options are. But the key questions are, number one, should the town exercise the option? Number two, the word facility, which is a small f in the original, so it's not a defined term. What's included in a facility? You're going to buy something. What are you buying exactly? I think it's understood at this point that it includes buildings and fixed equipment, does not include the transfer station, which raises another question, which is, should the town negotiate to buy the transfer station in 2025? And again, the town does not have an option to buy the transfer station, but you can always negotiate a purchase if that's what the town wants to do. And we've raised this question to Waste Options, and they're receptive to talking about it. So again, just to look at the word, the issues, there's the option. It covers the facility, which is defined as the composting building and related fixed equipment, but not the transfer station. And so the transfer station is really a separate question. If we go to the next slide, I just kind of summarize this because it turns down to really three questions. If 2026 looks like 2024, then the town would not be the owner of the composter, but would lease the site, assuming the composter were to continue operating. And we'd have to go through a process where we'd lease the site on which the transfer station is located, assuming the transfer station would still be used. Right now, there's no separate site lease. The site lease is rolled into the Waste Services Agreement. So getting there from here means making business arrangements to have a separate lease. Or the town could buy them both and own everything on the site, which has a certain appeal in terms of control and having the town in a better position to make decisions. That means exercising the option on the composter and negotiating the purchase on the transfer station. Where there's a hybrid model, the option has certain advantages. It's got a price in there of $1 million. The transfer station does not have a specified price, so that's something that would need to be determined, but you avoid that if you go through the lease process. So I think those are the three. I guess there's theoretically a fourth option, which is to not exercise the option and lease the composter and buy the transfer station, but it's hard to imagine why the town would go down that road, but it's theoretically possible. I mean, so this is just the basic decision very trying to keep it at a high level. Questions before we go on? Okay, let's see how much we can get through. Let's start with the composter. Next slide. And what I tried to do is to understand where we might go. Let's understand where we are. The town owns the site, and the landfill waste option owns the composter. In terms of operations, the composter is something of a black box to the town. The town directs the solid waste in, supports marketing efforts on the compost that goes out. And when there are residuals that come out, the town is providing disposal capacity. And they're listed on the DP permits to do this. But all the work of accepting, processing the solid waste, operating, maintaining facilities, managing the products, and moving the residuals is right now what waste option is doing. The town ultimately has liability for permitting issues. The ACO is the consent order, which is still out there. Compliance of the site with DP requirement, that's all on the town, and the town does the landfill groundwater monitoring and surface water monitoring, environmental monitoring in general. Waste options role for what it owns, it manages repairs, replacements, and changes in technology. So again, just to understand from a business point of view what the role of each of these entities has been under the existing model at a high level. Questions? So I'm going to go through this, and then I come out at the end and try to show what the differences are between the two, the option. Next slide. Okay, if you look at the key differences, if the town buys the composter, then what does it have to do from a procurement standpoint? If it wants to operate the composter, it has to put on an RFP or a bid document and procure a contract operator. If the town leases the composter, it's a little more complicated. And the issue is that the town is just leasing space in which Waste Options owns a facility. If you just put it out to bid and Waste Options is the only bidder, it's not a competitive process. If you want a competitive process, then you have to find a way for someone else to buy the composter or lease the composter from Waste Option. So there's a complication there that means that the bidding process might not be as competitive as you might want it to be. So from a procurement standpoint, again, this is one of the complications. If the town's the owner, it's easier to bring in a contract operator as opposed to going through this other process, which might be successful, but it's more complicated. In terms of capital equipment and technology, right now, Waste Option is doing that work. If the town just leased the site and let Waste Option or whoever won the bid control the facility, that would be their job. If the town's the owner, it's got to make capital equipment decisions and technology decisions and fund and finance. And I think what we've heard is that in the past, when the town has had facilities such as the MRF, it hasn't always done that consistently over time. But going forward, if the town is going to do the purchase, it also needs to be ready to set up systems and ways such that it can finance and implement any capital equipment requirements, major maintenance, and technology decisions at the facility. That's part of ownership. So with ownership comes that responsibility. And I think the other thing that is really the difference is if there comes a time when the composter is going to shut down, if the town owns it, the town decides its space, and the town could use as is or reuse it for other purposes. So we have a big building there, and if the town wants to shut down the composter and use the building for something, it can do that. If the town's not the owner and Waste Options is leasing the land, then you have, again, a little bit more complicated situation, which is similar to the South. Maybe there's a buyout. Maybe Waste Option would actually remove or abandon the building or equipment, but it's more complicated than the town making decision. There's another party that's the owner, for which there has to be a role in making that decision. And I think if you look at all the other risks of operation and maintenance, you can pretty much give them to a contract operator other than these. So the decision of buy or don't buy really comes down to procurement, control of the capital investment in the site, and ownership of what happens at the end, at the end of term or at a termination scenario. And so again, I realize this is a lot of material late, but I just wanted to put this out to start getting into the understanding of, what are you deciding when you decide to buy? You're also deciding to control capital and technology going forward and to control the fate at the end of life.
George, this is really helpful. This has been great. Matt, you have a question?
But it's assuming that the composter is going to be the preferred method is going to be used for the next X amount of years, correct?
That's correct.
Is that an assumption that the composter is the technology we're going to continue to use?
At this point, I think, and we talked about this a little bit last time, but the presumption is that if we can get to the point where the composter is actually creating compost for which there is a use, then it's there. There are a lot of benefits to using it going forward. If DP comes down tomorrow with a standard, which we don't think will happen, that says, any compost that has any PFAS in it at all can't be used, and there's no way that Nantucket will ever be able to use compost, then you look at the composter a little different. So absolutely, the value of the composter in terms of as part of the waste management system is part of this decision. But the other consideration is that when you buy the composter, you're also buying a large building for a pretty good price. And if you were to do something else that required a building, it might make sense to buy it even if you weren't going to use it as a compost. So again, that's another aspect of the decision, which is you're buying the composter, but it comes with the building, it comes with a biofilter, it comes with a smaller building with a tip floor on it, and they also have value. And if the price is $1 million, that's something to think about. And again, go ahead.
Sorry, finish what you're saying, George. I thought you were done.
Yeah, no, so I'm just, trying to say, you're making a purchase decision. What are you buying? And that's also why the scope of what you're buying is important to understand, that you are getting a building that at one point was on Waste Options books at $6 million. Condition to the building is going to be an important part of this as well. So I think, we're looking at doing it, making sure we understand what's being bought before it's being bought. But again, just trying to lay out the pros and cons and what the issues are when you're about to make a purchase.
The other reason for composting, whether it be in the composter or in windrows or, off island somehow, although I doubt we want to be shipping food waste off island, is that DEP has a waste ban on commercial organics. So any business generating 50 tons or more a week of organics, that has to be composted. And they're increasingly lowering that threshold. So the 50 tons starts in November. It's currently 100 tons, but that, you can see the beginning trend of lowering that threshold. So we do need to be able to compost in some way, whether that be locally or however else.
Other comments? Okay, let's go to the next slide just very briefly, because I'm looking at 5 minutes, but I just want to make. Okay, I'm going to not go through this, but this is an attempt to put out a timeline. If we've got 3 years to do this, we had better be on town meeting in 2024 at the latest. And which means we're going to be doing a whole lot of thinking in 2023 to do this, probably starting with developing business terms this year. Either way we go. Some of them are overlapping, but probably 2023 is decision time so that we can be ready for 2024. And we could, this is something to spend a little more time at when you have more time to look at it, but I just want to make the timeline point. Questions? Okay, let's get to the next slide. Again, this is the equivalent for the transfer station. And again, same thing, town owns the site, Waste Options owns the transfer station. Basically, the town is clearing the way for waste to be delivered to it, but the town is really not in the C&D waste management business. And if we're, though they do have some liability for the site complying with environmental standards, this is really Waste Options at this point as a standalone business. It's going to change if it's Waste Options, even if it isn't, even if somebody buys a transfer station from them, it's part of some sort of procurement. If the deal is that the town leases the land instead of buying the transfer station, then the town doesn't need to be in the C&D business in the same way. So let's go to the next slide just to get to the comparable one that I showed. The procurement, it's going to be complicated in any event, because either you're negotiating a purchase or you're holding a procurement that either is not going to be competitive, or if it's going to be competitive, it's because you've negotiated some sort of purchase and somebody else is doing the purchasing, or you're giving that opportunity. Again, the owner would control and plan finances and implement technology decisions, which Waste Options would do if they're the owner. And end of life, if the town owns the building, they can use it for something else. They can repurpose it, which is not the case if Waste Option owns it. And if I just want to get to the next slide and keeping an eye on the clock, same timeline. I'm not going to go through it again. Next slide. Let's go to the last slide, Yurika. Okay, just pros and cons of ownership. And again, this might be something to think about between now and the next workshop. But pros, the owner has control of capital projects and technology upgrades, and frankly, responsibility for major maintenance and for what happens at the end of the contract. You're not, in terms of money, you're not paying for the return on equity of someone else who's bought a building or is operating it as a profit-making business. The other thing I would say is right now, the Composter building, fair market value, assuming it's in decent shape, looks a whole lot more than $1 million. So if you buy it for $1 million, it looks like a discount. Cons, got to come up with the money. I did not put a number out for the transfer station because this is public session, and at some point it may be appropriate to do an executive session if we get to that point about talking about dollars. I don't want to be talking about competitive purchase dollars in a public session. That's probably appropriate for private session, but in any event, whatever the dollar is, if you're buying it, you're paying for it, and then you're taking on the responsibility and all the approval and procurement procedures that go with any public ownership, which the town knows how to do and does, but has its burdens of administration. So I think that's at least the first pass in the time of the own purchase decision. And I know that we don't have a lot of time for discussion, but hopefully there are enough concepts out there that we can take this to the next session and have the next level of discussion at that time. Any quick questions before we go any further at this point? Good. Thank you. At least the discussion has started, and I appreciate having the time to do that. So Libby, I'll throw it back to you.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Graham.
Yes, thank you, George, and thank you, Graham. I think the next step is for the internal group to get back together, sort through what we heard tonight, and come up with some interim recommendations on some of these programs and bring them to you before our next scheduled workshop, which, if we're going to stick with the quarterly schedule, is most likely sometime in May. Get that scheduled and develop a more direct focus on the contract expiration and what all needs to be done in order to deal with that, specific to board policy decisions and things like that.
Sounds good. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Any last
Did you
thoughts?
adjourn?
Motion to adjourn?
Second,
All those in favor? Melissa,
aye.
Matt,
Aye.
aye. Was that an
Aye.
aye?
That's an aye.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.